Please be seated. So I started the sermon at 8 o'clock with sympathy for Alan, who had to preach last week on a gospel of law, and sympathy for myself once I opened up the text for this week and realized I had to do the same thing. And now at 10 o'clock, I'm realizing our loving deacon, Nancy Pease, who embodies the grace and love of God, had the glorious opportunity to read a gospel of law, filled with its corresponding judgment. Sorry, Nancy. It goes that way sometimes. And we all might have known, those of us, Alan and Nancy and I, who are involved in this work, that we were going to be facing some intense focus on the law from the Gospel of Matthew, that identifies the Messiah as the new Moses, the new lawgiver. If you were to sit down this afternoon while you're waiting for the Super Bowl to start and read through the Gospel of Matthew, you would just be completely taken aback by how many times the Gospel of Matthew compares Jesus to Moses. That is Matthew's Gospel. Of course, then we also have in the New Testament the Apostle Paul, who gives we Protestants all of our arguments about salvation via grace rather than works. But Matthew asks us to leave behind our comfortable Lutheran and Calvinist bunkers and approach the law of Moses with an open heart and an open mind, as if there might be something new for us to learn. Jesus says in Matthew, I didn't come to abolish the law, I have come to fulfill it. Jesus' words, I think, upset our understanding that the law, that was somewhere in the past. That was the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the old understanding of relationship with God. And, well, we have this new understanding now. We now have the covenant of grace, or the New Testament. But I wonder, as I wrestle with this, how our life in the Spirit might be supported by a deep engagement with the law of Moses. And I wonder if possibly our Protestant-formed brains are missing something. I wonder if it's not simply either or, but rather both and then more than both. So I've been reading and listening to things about the life and times of Teresa of Avila this week. And she was also wrestling with the place of law and grace in her own spiritual life. Of course, this would make sense if we remember that her historical setting was the Counter-Reformation in Spain. Just as the Protestants were wrangling over law and grace, so in the Counter-Reformation were the Roman Catholics. At the same time, they were having their own Reformation. And her geographic setting is that arid and hot climate of south-central Spain, a place where, up until just a generation earlier, when all of the Jews and Muslims were kicked out of Spain, for 800 years, Jews and Muslims and Christians alike had been comparing the spiritual life to a well-irrigated garden, a metaphor that Teresa claims for her own. And she says that when a person first begins to seek God, they open their eyes and they look upon their soul, and they see a landscape choked by refuse and weeds. Their soul longs for God, but knows itself to be powerless and barren. And so the self says to the self, I will irrigate my soul. I will reclaim this garden for God. And so each right action, each good deed, each following the letter of the law, is like another bucket dipped into the well, lifted, and carried back to the garden, poured out in irrigation. And the person grows strong with all this labor, bucket by bucket. And the garden begins its transformation. Even with this simple fits and starts irrigation that can't be all that effective. But as the garden of the soul begins to grow and transform, the desire for God's nearness grows as well. And no longer is this bucket by bucket irrigation enough. And so in his longing, the person constructs a windmill. He's learning through the spiritual life and spiritual practice how to irrigate the soul garden more effectively. And the water of the Spirit begins to flow in more naturally and more fluidly, and the soul softens and ripens. Sometimes it takes a while with the garden and with the soul. But the person begins to spend more and more time in the garden, and so draws nearer and nearer to God. And suddenly an irrigating river appears in the midst of the garden, flowing through the garden, making the water of the Spirit for that garden ever more near at hand and easy to access. And the person turns naturally and simply to the work of irrigating, and trees grow, and they burst into bloom. And the person continues to tend the soul's garden. And the garden is longing for union with its beloved. And the beloved hears. And the beloved sends rain. The gardener's desire for God's nearness and the soul garden's welcome of God's presence become a unifying force. And the rains continue, and the irrigation now is rhythmic and natural, and the soul garden drinks in God's love and bears fruit. Where is the law? Is the law the first step of irrigation? Going back and forth, bucket by bucket to that well? Following perhaps the first or lower step of the spiritual journey, one that conditions the soul so that it eventually can receive God's grace? Or is law found in that final fruit of the soul's garden, a benefit of the grace that the soul has received? Is law a first step? Is law a crowning glory? Well, at this point, Teresa, as all the mystics, shifts her irrigation metaphor, pulls out the ground from underneath us, and says, but you know, this is not a step-by-step process. This is not chronological. This garden exists out of time. And irrigating happens all these different ways, all at once. Because from the moment that the soul seeks God, and sees its own need, God has already created a perfect interior garden. And each moment of back-breaking irrigation labor is mysteriously also a corresponding bearing of fruit. And each step of the journey is also mysteriously a manifestation of the entire journey. So God's grace, according to Teresa, works through our intention. God's grace has the power to strengthen faint hearts and weak knees. God's irrigating grace transforms the garden of our souls. Following the law is like tracing steps back and forth to and from the well until we can make that journey by heart. Following the law is attained with the ultimate fruit bearing of the irrigated garden. And, she says, and God's grace is at work beyond any intention we might have. God's grace moves in our lives even when our knees are weak and our hearts are faint. God's grace can transform our soul garden before we even awake to the desire for God. God works in our lives even when we turn away from God's law, first given in Moses and perfected in Christ. God's longing for us and love for us is that deep. The all-powerful force that is the maker of the universe, that needs nothing outside of itself, is nevertheless hungry for us to take a first step. God's all mercy loves us into walking. God's all-knowing desires that we do the work so that we can see the barren soul's garden, not through our own eyes, but through the eyes of God. God yearns that we see that we were already God's beautiful, multifaceted diamond. By the irrigating rhythm of God, which is both law and grace, sin is overcome. The world is redeemed. The cosmos made perfect. And it all starts with that first journey to the well, pulling up a single bucket to irrigate the soul's garden.